Kira Montrose's fingers trembled as she adjusted her navy blazer for what felt like the 100th time that morning. The fabric rough against her palms and bearing the telltale signs of previous ownership. The brass buttons, though polished to a shine, showed the wear patterns of another student's grip, and the hem had been taken up unevenly, leaving tiny needle holes where the original stitching had been removed. At barely 5 feet tall, with a frame so slight that even the smallest uniform size hung loose on her narrow shoulders, she had spent the better part of 6 months at Westfield Academy, perfecting the delicate art of becoming invisible. The corridors of the prestigious boarding school stretched before her like marble-floored canyons, their walls lined with oil paintings of stern-faced benefactors and distinguished alumni whose eyes seemed to track her movement with disapproving judgment. Morning sunlight streamed through tall Gothic windows, casting long shadows that she used as cover, slipping from one pool of darkness to the next with the practiced efficiency of prey, avoiding predators. The familiar sounds of wealth and privilege echoed around her. Designer shoes clicking against polished stone, expensive cologne mixing with the scent of fresh flowers that were replaced daily by an army of maintenance staff, and the confident laughter of students who had never questioned their right to occupy space in the world. Her worn leather messenger bag, a graduation gift from her grandmother 3 years prior, seemed to grow heavier with each step. Inside were textbooks purchased second-hand, their margins already filled with the notes of previous owners, and notebooks from the dollar store that she rationed carefully to last the semester. The weight wasn't just physical. It carried the hopes of her entire family, the sacrifices her mother had made, working double shifts at the diner, the pride in her grandmother's voice when the scholarship letter had arrived. That letter had promised opportunity, a chance to escape the cycle of poverty that had defined her family for generations. It had not mentioned the isolation, the constant reminder that she didn't belong, or the daily navigation of a social hierarchy as rigid and unforgiving as any medieval court. The assembly hall loomed ahead like a cathedral of academia, its oak-paneled walls stretching toward a vaulted ceiling painted with scenes of classical learning. Portraits of distinguished alumni gazed down from gilded frames, their faces bearing the confident expressions of men and women who had shaped industries, influenced governments, and accumulated fortunes that most people couldn't comprehend. The morning light filtered through stained glass windows depicting the school's coat of arms and motto, Virtus et Sapientia, virtue and wisdom. The irony of those words wasn't lost on Kira as she navigated the sea of identical uniforms, each one tailored to perfection and worn with the casual confidence that only came from a lifetime of privilege. She slipped into her usual seat near the back, in the shadow of a marble column that provided both physical and psychological cover. The worn velvet cushion had molded itself to her slight frame over the months, becoming a small island of familiarity in an ocean of hostility. Her dark eyes, large in her pale face, swept the room with the wariness of someone who had learned that danger could come from any direction at any moment. The other students filled the space with their chatter, their voices carrying the cadences of private tutors and European vacations, of summer homes in the Hamptons and skiing trips to Aspen. Her fingers unconsciously traced the small tear in her blazer's sleeve, a souvenir from yesterday's encounter with Preston Blackwood and his carefully curated circle of tormentors. The rip was barely visible, hidden beneath her arm, but she could feel it like a brand against her skin. It served as a constant reminder of her precarious position in this world, a physical manifestation of how easily the facade of belonging could be stripped away. Preston Blackwood occupied his throne 3 rows ahead, with the casual authority of someone born to rule. His broad shoulders filled out his blazer with mathematical precision, every line tailored to emphasize the powerful frame that hours of rowing and lacrosse had sculpted. The morning light caught the golden highlights in his perfectly styled hair, creating an almost angelic halo effect that made the cruelty in his clear blue eyes seem even more startling. At 18, he possessed the kind of classical good looks that photographers loved and casting directors sought. Strong jaw, aristocratic nose, and the kind of confident posture that suggested he had never encountered a door that wouldn't open for him or a problem that money couldn't solve. His blazer bore the subtle but unmistakable signs of true privilege. The fabric was a shade richer than regulation required, the cut more sophisticated, and the school crest had been embroidered with gold thread instead of the standard navy. On his wrist sat a vintage Rolex Submariner that cost more than most families earned in a year, a 16th birthday gift from a grandfather who had made his fortune in shipping before diversifying into real estate and political influence. Preston wore it with the same casual indifference that he applied to everything else in his life, as if luxury were simply the natural state of existence rather than something to be earned or appreciated. Beside him sat Wade Thornton, his faithful lieutenant and the physical embodiment of every cruel henchman from literature. Where Preston was elegant brutality, Wade was blunt force trauma, given human form. His stocky frame was built like a bulldog, with short, thick limbs and a neck that seemed to merge directly with his shoulders. His red hair was cropped short in a style that emphasized the aggressive set of his jaw and the small, mean eyes that seemed to catalogue weakness with the efficiency of a predator. Wade's family had earned their fortune in construction, building shopping centers and housing developments, with the kind of ruthless efficiency that had left environmental groups scrambling to keep up with their permits and protests. He carried himself with the swagger of someone who had never met a problem that couldn't be solved with sufficient application of force. The third member of their unholy trinity was Jasper Knox, whose aristocratic features masked a mind as sharp and cutting as a surgical blade. He was tall and lean like Preston, but where Preston radiated physical intimidation, Jasper's power came from his ability to find and exploit psychological weakness. His grey eyes were the colour of winter storms, cold and calculating, and they seemed to dissect everyone they encountered with clinical precision. His father was a federal judge, his mother a prominent surgeon, and he had inherited their combined gifts for analysis and their complete lack of empathy for those they deemed inferior. Jasper's cruelty was refined, surgical in its precision, designed to leave the deepest possible scars with the most efficient application of malice. "Settle down, everyone," announced Headmaster Brennan from the elaborately carved podium that had been donated by the class of 1887. His voice, cultured by decades of addressing audiences of wealth and influence, carried easily through the vaulted space without need for amplification. Dr. Brennan was a man in his early 60s, with silver hair combed in the kind of style that hadn't changed in 50 years, and wire-rimmed spectacles that gave him the appearance of a scholarly owl. He had been at Westfield for nearly 3 decades, having arrived as a young English teacher and worked his way up through the administrative ranks with the patient determination of someone who understood that true power came from being indispensable to those who held the purse strings. "Before we begin today's announcements," he continued, his tone carrying the practiced authority of someone who had delivered this same speech hundreds of times, "I'd like to remind you all that Westfield Academy prides itself on fostering an environment of respect and mutual support among our student body. We are not merely an institution of learning, but a community bound together by shared values and common purpose." Kira almost laughed at the bitter irony of those words. Respect and mutual support were concepts that existed only in the official school literature and the glossy brochures sent to prospective families. The reality of daily existence within these hallowed halls was far more Darwinian, a constant struggle for social survival where weakness was not just discouraged, but actively punished. She thought back to her first day at Westfield when she had arrived with such naive hope, clutching her acceptance letter like a golden ticket to a better future. The memory was still vivid enough to make her stomach clench with remembered humiliation. She had accidentally bumped into Preston in the dining hall, her nervous energy and unfamiliarity with the social geography making her clumsy. The collision had been minor, barely enough to jostle his perfectly balanced breakfast tray, but the look of disgust that had crossed his aristocratic features when he had taken in her obvious otherness had set the tone for everything that followed. He had looked at her second-hand uniform, her nervous posture, and her obvious attempts to blend in, and in that moment she had been catalogued, categorized, and marked for destruction. "I'm sorry," she had stammered, reaching out instinctively to steady his tray, but he had jerked away from her touch as if she carried some contagious disease. "Watch where you're going," he had said, his voice carrying just loud enough for nearby students to hear, but not so loud as to attract faculty attention. "Some of us belong here." The words had hit her like a physical blow, but it was the laughter from his companions that had really sealed her fate. Wade's cruel chuckle and Jasper's superior smirk had established the parameters of her existence at Westfield. She was not a fellow student to be respected or even ignored, but rather a source of entertainment, a target for their boredom and cruelty. "Now then," Headmaster Brennan's voice pulled her back to the present, "I'd like to call your attention to our upcoming winter formal. As many of you know, this event represents one of our most cherished traditions, dating back to the founding of the Academy in 1847. Committee sign-ups will be posted outside the main office immediately following assembly." Kira's heart performed a complicated gymnastics routine in her chest at the mention of the dance. For weeks now, she had been nurturing a secret hope that seemed to grow stronger and more dangerous with each passing day. Marcus Rivera, the quiet boy from her advanced literature class, had been occupying an increasing amount of her thoughts and daydreams. He had kind brown eyes that reminded her of warm chocolate, and a gentle smile that made her stomach flutter with butterflies whenever he looked in her direction. More importantly, he was one of the precious few students who actually acknowledged her existence as something more than an inconvenient obstacle or a source of amusement. Marcus was different from the others in ways that went beyond simple kindness. He came from money. His family owned a successful chain of restaurants throughout California, but he wore his privilege lightly, without the aggressive entitlement that characterized most of his classmates. He had been the one to defend her when other students made snide comments about her scholarship status, usually doing so with a quiet word or a strategic change of subject rather than direct confrontation. His approach was diplomatic, where others might have been inflammatory, and Kira had come to appreciate the careful way he navigated the treacherous social waters of Westfield Academy. "Hey, Montrose!" Wade Thornton's voice cut through her romantic reverie like a rusty blade through silk. He had turned around in his seat, his freckled face twisted into the familiar expression of malicious glee that meant someone was about to suffer for his entertainment. His small eyes glittered with the kind of cruel anticipation that she had learned to recognize as a warning sign. "Still dreaming about the dance? Who's gonna take you? The janitor?" The words hit her like arrows, each one carefully aimed to find the most vulnerable spots in her already fragile armor. The suggestion was designed to be devastating on multiple levels. It reminded her of her low social status, implied that she was undesirable, and reduced her to nothing more than an object of mockery. Around them, other students began to turn and listen, sensing blood in the water, with the instinctive awareness of predators who had learned to recognize when one of their number was being hunted. Preston's laugh was a thing of terrible beauty, low and cultured and utterly without warmth. It was the kind of laugh that belonged in drawing rooms and country clubs, refined by generations of breeding and education, but hollow at its core. "Come on, Wade," he said, his voice carrying the amused tolerance of a king indulging a particularly clever jester. "Don't be ridiculous. Even the janitor has standards." The casual cruelty of the statement was breathtaking in its efficiency. With just a few words, Preston had managed to suggest that she was so far beneath consideration that even the lowest status person at the school would reject her. It was character assassination delivered with surgical precision, designed to leave her feeling worthless and alone while appearing to be nothing more than harmless banter to any adult who might overhear. The words hit Kira like physical blows, each one landing with the precision of a boxer who had studied his opponent's weaknesses and knew exactly where to strike for maximum damage. But she had learned, through months of painful experience, that reacting only made things worse. Any sign of hurt or anger would be seized upon and amplified, turned into further ammunition for their cruelty. Instead, she forced her expression to remain neutral, drawing on techniques that Master Chen had taught her during her years of training at the small dojo back home. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her, and it burned like acid in her chest. Here she sat, allowing herself to be terrorized by a group of privileged bullies, when she was in fact a third-degree black belt in Taekwondo with 3 regional championship titles under her belt. The trophy case in her grandmother's living room back home told a very different story about Kira Montrose than the one being written in the halls of Westfield Academy. Those trophies spoke of years of dedication, countless hours of training, and the kind of physical and mental discipline that most people would never possess. She could still remember the weight of the gold medal from the state championship, the way it had felt around her neck as she stood on the podium with tears of joy streaming down her face. Master Chen had been in the audience that day, his weathered face glowing with pride as he watched his student claim the victory they had worked so hard to achieve. "You have found your warrior spirit," he had told her afterward. "Never let anyone take that away from you." But Master Chen's lessons had been about more than just physical technique, more than just the ability to break boards or defeat opponents in competition. True strength, he had always said, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent studying the martial arts, comes from knowing when not to fight. A warrior's greatest victory is the battle they never have to wage. Violence should always be the last resort, used only when all other options have been exhausted. Those words had shaped her approach to conflict throughout her teenage years, guiding her through the inevitable confrontations that arose in high school. She had managed to graduate without ever using her martial arts training in anger, a fact that had made Master Chen proud and had given her a sense of moral superiority over her more aggressive classmates. But that philosophy was being tested in ways she had never anticipated at Westfield Academy. The problem was that Master Chen's wisdom had been developed in a different context, in a world where conflicts could be avoided or resolved through patience and de-escalation. At Westfield, she was discovering that there were some battles that couldn't be avoided, some predators who interpreted restraint as weakness and kindness as an invitation to attack. Her commitment to non-violence was being used against her, turned into a weapon by those who sensed her unwillingness to fight back. After assembly, she made her way through the corridors with the careful navigation of someone who had mapped every potential ambush point and safe haven in the building. The library had become her primary refuge, a sanctuary among towering bookshelves where she could lose herself in worlds where justice prevailed and the underdog eventually triumphed. The familiar scent of old paper and leather bindings usually worked like aromatherapy on her frayed nerves, but today even this sacred space felt contaminated by the morning's humiliation. The Westfield Academy Library was a monument to learning that had been constructed with the same attention to grandeur as a European cathedral. Soaring shelves stretched toward a ceiling, painted with allegorical scenes of knowledge conquering ignorance, while reading tables carved from single pieces of mahogany provided study spaces for students whose families had donated entire wings to ensure their admission. First edition classics sat behind glass cases like precious artifacts, and the rare books collection contained volumes that some universities would kill to possess. Kira had claimed a corner table near the poetry section, a spot that was generally avoided by other students and provided multiple escape routes should she need to make a hasty retreat. The table itself was scarred with decades of use, its surface bearing the faint impressions of countless essays and assignments written by generations of Westfield students. She had grown to love those imperfections, finding comfort in the knowledge that she wasn't the first person to seek refuge in this quiet corner of the academic world. She had barely settled into her usual chair and opened her copy of Pride and Prejudice, a battered paperback that looked shameful next to the leather-bound editions that other students carried, when she heard footsteps approaching across the thick Persian rug that covered the library's marble floor. Her head snapped up with the alertness of a deer sensing predators, but the face that greeted her made her pulse quicken for entirely different reasons. Marcus Rivera stood beside her chair like something from a Renaissance painting, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that made her fingers itch to brush it back into place. He was tall, but not intimidatingly so, with the kind of lean build that spoke of natural athleticism rather than obsessive gym sessions. His olive complexion hinted at his Mexican heritage, something that would have been considered exotic in the predominantly white world of Westfield Academy, if not for the fact that his family's wealth made him effectively immune to the kind of discrimination that might have targeted a less financially secure student. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice carrying the warm tones that had made her fall in love with their Shakespeare discussions in advanced literature. There was something about the way he spoke, careful and thoughtful, as if he actually considered the weight of his words before releasing them into the world. That set him apart from the careless arrogance that characterized most of their classmates. "Of course," she managed to say, gesturing toward the empty chair across from her with hands that were suddenly unsteady. Her voice came out slightly breathless, and she hoped he would attribute it to surprise rather than the overwhelming attraction that made her feel lightheaded whenever he was near. Marcus settled into the chair with the kind of graceful movement that suggested years of expensive lessons. Tennis, perhaps, or fencing, the sorts of activities that wealthy families use to instill poise and confidence in their children. He was wearing the same uniform as every other male student at Westfield, but somehow he made it look effortlessly elegant rather than stuffy or pretentious. His tie was knotted with mathematical precision, and his blazer showed none of the wrinkles or wear that marked Kira's second-hand uniform. "I saw what happened in assembly," he said, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. "Preston and his crew are complete jerks." Kira's cheeks burned with embarrassment that felt like hot coals against her skin. The fact that Marcus had witnessed her humiliation made it infinitely worse, transforming what had been a private shame into something that would now exist between them forever. She wanted to sink through the floor, to disappear into the building's foundation and never resurface. "It's nothing I can't handle," she said, the words coming out with more bravado than she felt. It was a lie, of course. She wasn't handling it at all, merely enduring it like someone suffering from a chronic illness. But admitting weakness to Marcus felt impossible. "You shouldn't have to handle it at all," Marcus replied, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that made her look up from her book. There was anger there, carefully controlled, but definitely present, and it was anger on her behalf. The realization that someone cared enough to be upset about her treatment was almost overwhelming. "Preston thinks he owns this place just because his daddy donated an entire wing to the science building," and his grandfather endowed a chair in the economics department. For a moment that stretched between them like a bridge, Kira allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to have someone stand up for her, to not face each day feeling like prey in a world full of predators. The fantasy was intoxicating and dangerous. It made her want things she couldn't have, made her hope for changes that would never come. In her experience, people who tried to help her only ended up becoming targets themselves, and she couldn't bear the thought of Marcus suffering because of his association with her. "I should get to class," she said, beginning to pack her books with hands that shook slightly from the effort of maintaining her composure. The familiar routine of stacking textbooks and organizing notes gave her something to focus on, besides the way Marcus was looking at her with such concern and kindness. Kira. The sound of her name in his voice was like music, and when his hand brushed hers as she reached for her notebook, it sent electricity shooting up her arm and straight to her heart. The contact lasted only seconds, but it was enough to make her entire body aware of his presence in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. "Would you maybe want to go to the winter formal with me?" The words came out in a rush, as if he had been holding them back, and they had finally broken free of their own accord. The world seemed to stop spinning on its axis. Kira stared at him with wide eyes, certain that she had misheard, or that this was some elaborate joke whose punchline would be revealed at her expense. Boys like Marcus Rivera didn't ask girls like her to dances. It was a fundamental law of the social universe, as reliable as gravity or thermodynamics. "You want to go with me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air between them, fragile as spun glass and twice as likely to shatter. "I've wanted to ask you for weeks," he admitted, his cheeks flushing slightly with a vulnerability that made him even more attractive. "You're the most intelligent person in our advanced literature class, and you have this way of seeing things that others miss. Your essay on the symbolism in The Great Gatsby was brilliant. It made me rethink everything I thought I knew about the novel. I think you're amazing." The words hit her like a physical force, knocking the breath from her lungs and making her heart pound so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. No one had ever called her amazing before, certainly not someone like Marcus. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have this one perfect thing. Before she could find the words to respond, the moment was shattered by the sound of slow, mocking applause that echoed through the library's vaulted spaces like the tolling of a funeral bell. Preston Blackwood emerged from behind a nearby bookshelf with the theatrical timing of a villain making his entrance in the final act of a tragedy. His aristocratic features were arranged in an expression of mock admiration that somehow made his handsome face look cruel and ugly. "How touching," he drawled, his cultured voice dripping with sarcasm as thick as honey. "Romeo and Juliet, starring the scholarship kid and the bleeding heart liberal. I think I might actually cry from the sheer romance of it all." Wade Thornton and Jasper Knox flanked him like faithful hunting dogs, their presence immediately making the spacious library feel claustrophobic and threatening. Wade's stocky frame blocked one potential escape route, while Jasper's lean form cut off another, and Kira realized with growing alarm that this confrontation had been planned and orchestrated with military precision. They had been watching and waiting for exactly this kind of moment. Marcus stood up slowly, his jaw clenched with barely contained anger, and his hands balled into fists at his sides. For someone who generally avoided confrontation, he looked ready to throw the first punch, and Kira could see the tension radiating from his body like heat from a furnace. "Walk away, Preston," he said, his voice steady despite the obvious fury that was making his dark eyes flash with dangerous light. "This doesn't concern you, doesn't it?" Preston stepped closer. using his considerable height advantage to loom over Marcus in a display of intimidation that was as old as humanity itself. "See, I think it concerns me very much when someone from our social circle decides to engage in what can only be described as charity work. It reflects poorly on all of us." "Leave him alone," Kira found herself saying, the words escaping before she could stop them. Her voice carried more strength than she felt, but she couldn't sit there and watch Marcus be threatened because of her. Preston's attention shifted to her with the lazy focus of a predator who had just noticed a wounded animal attempting to limp away from the hunting ground. His smile was sharp enough to cut glass, and his blue eyes glittered with malicious anticipation. "Oh, look who found her voice," he said with exaggerated surprise. "Tell me, Montrose, what exactly do you think you bring to this equation? Rivera here could have any girl in school. Daughters of senators, heiresses to multinational corporations, girls whose trust funds could buy and sell your entire hometown, and he chooses this." He gestured dismissively at her slight frame, with the kind of casual cruelty that suggested he had been practicing the motion. "She's worth 10 of you!" Marcus shot back, stepping protectively in front of Kira with the instinctive chivalry that had probably been programmed into him by generations of well-bred ancestors. "She has more intelligence and integrity in her little finger than you have in your entire body." "Is she now?" Preston's voice took on a dangerous edge that made the temperature in the library seem to drop several degrees. "I think it's time we put that theory to the test, don't you?" The threat hung in the air between them like a blade, sharp and unmistakable. Kira felt ice forming in her veins as she realized that her worst fears were coming true. Marcus was going to suffer because of his association with her, the fighting skills she had worked so hard to keep hidden. The confrontation ended there, with Preston and his crew withdrawing like wolves who had marked their territory and would return later to claim their kill. But the damage had been done, and Kira knew with sick certainty that this was far from over. Preston Blackwood didn't make idle threats, and she had just painted a target on both herself and the one person at Westfield Academy who had shown her genuine kindness. Her fears proved justified the very next morning when the sound of Marcus's voice, tight with pain and frustration, echoed from the marble stairwell that connected the main academic building to the dormitory wings. The acoustics of the space carried sound with crystalline clarity, and Kira could hear every word as clearly as if she was standing in the middle of the confrontation. "Just leave her out of this, Preston," Marcus was saying, his voice strained in a way that made Kira's stomach clench with dread. "Leave her out of what?" Preston's response carried that same mockingly innocent tone he had perfected, the verbal equivalent of a cobra's smile. "I'm just trying to understand what you see in her. Maybe you're into the whole wounded bird thing, some kind of savior complex you need to work through?" Kira crept closer to the stairwell on feet that seemed to move of their own accord, her heart hammering against her ribs with such force that she was surprised it didn't echo through the corridors. The ornate banister provided cover as she peered down at the scene unfolding below, and what she saw made her blood turn to ice in her veins. Marcus was backed against the wall like a cornered animal, with Preston and his crew forming a menacing semicircle around him. Wade held Marcus's expensive leather backpack in his thick hands, casually tossing books and carefully organized notes down the marble stairs with the indifferent cruelty of someone destroying another person's possessions for entertainment. Each item that hit the steps made a sound like a small explosion, and Kira could see Marcus flinch with every impact. "You know what I think?" Preston continued, his voice taking on the conversational tone that somehow made it more menacing than any shouting could have been. "I think you asked her to the dance as some kind of charity case. Poor little scholarship girl, all alone and friendless, and here comes Marcus Rivera to rescue her from social obscurity." "That's not true," Marcus said through gritted teeth, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. But Kira could hear the doubt creeping into his voice, the way Preston's psychological warfare was finding its mark. No. Then prove it. Preston stepped closer, invading Marcus's personal space with the aggressive confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. Take someone else to the dance, someone more suitable to your station. Amanda Worthington is available, and her father just bought that newspaper chain. Think of the networking opportunities. Go to hell. The words had barely left Marcus's mouth when Preston's fist connected with his stomach in a blow that doubled him over and drove the air from his lungs in a painful whoosh. Marcus gasped and clutched at his midsection, and that's when Kira saw red tinting the edges of her vision like drops of blood on a white cloth. Every instinct screamed at her to intervene, to use the years of training and the fighting skills she had worked so hard to develop. Her muscles coiled with remembered precision, her body shifting unconsciously into the ready stance that Master Chen had drilled into her until it became as natural as breathing. She could see exactly how the fight would unfold. A step forward to close the distance, a palm strike to Preston's solar plexus to disable him, a sweep kick to take Wade's legs out from under him, an elbow strike to Jasper's throat to prevent him from calling for help. But Master Chen's voice echoed in her mind with the persistence of a mantra repeated 10,000 times. The moment you use your training in anger, you become no better than those who would harm others. Violence born of rage is not justice. It is merely revenge wearing a prettier mask. So she stayed hidden behind the banister, watching helplessly as Preston and his crew delivered their message with the methodical cruelty of professional torturers. They worked Marcus over with scientific precision, each blow calculated to cause maximum pain without leaving marks that would be visible to faculty members. Wade's thick fists found soft spots in Marcus's ribs, while Jasper used pressure points to inflict agony without obvious injury. By the time they finished their ugly work, Marcus was slumped against the wall like a broken puppet, his lips split and bleeding, his uniform disheveled, and his dark eyes filled with a mixture of pain and shame that made Kira want to scream with fury and helplessness. "Remember what I said about the dance, Rivera?" Preston called over his shoulder as they walked away with the casual indifference of someone who had just completed a routine chore. "Make the smart choice. We wouldn't want your new girlfriend to get hurt because of your poor judgment." The threat was explicit enough to make Kira's knees weak with fear. She waited until Preston and his crew had disappeared around the corner before rushing to Marcus's side, her hands shaking with suppressed rage and the overwhelming need to help him. He looked up at her with eyes that held a mixture of pain and shame, and the expression on his face broke something fundamental inside her chest. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice rough with pain and humiliation. "I'm so sorry, Kira." "For what?" she asked, though she already knew what he was going to say, could see it written in the defeated slump of his shoulders and the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes. "I can't take you to the dance," he said, each word seeming to cause him physical pain. "I want to. God knows I want to. But I can't put you through what they'll do if I don't back down. They'll make your life even more miserable than it already is, and I can't be responsible for that." The words hit her harder than any physical blow could have. She helped Marcus to his feet, with hands that trembled from the effort of containing her emotions, watching as he gathered his scattered belongings with the careful movements of someone whose ribs were screaming in protest. "It's okay," she heard herself saying, the lie tasting like ashes in her mouth. "I understand." But she didn't understand. She understood only that she was tired of being afraid, tired of watching people she cared about suffer because of her presence in their lives, tired of being treated like something unclean that contaminated everything it touched. As she walked Marcus to the nurse's office, supporting his weight when his injuries made him stumble, A cold resolve began to settle in her chest, like winter frost forming on a window. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of renewed isolation and simmering anger. Marcus avoided her eyes in advanced literature class, his guilt and shame creating a barrier between them that felt more impermeable than steel. Other students who had begun to acknowledge her existence retreated back into indifference, as if Preston's dominance display had reminded them of the social order and their place within it. Even the few faculty members who had shown her kindness seemed to grow more distant, as if her association with trouble made her radioactive. Kira threw herself into her studies with desperate intensity, using homework and research papers as shields against the growing darkness that threatened to consume her. She spent her evenings in the library, long after other students had returned to their dormitories for social activities and leisure time, losing herself in the works of authors who understood suffering and transformation. She read Dickens and Hugo, finding kinship with Jean Valjean and Oliver Twist, characters who had faced adversity and emerged stronger. But the breaking point came 2 weeks later, during what should have been a routine morning assembly. Kira had been running late, having spent the night lying awake in her narrow dormitory bed and replaying every humiliation, every moment of helplessness, every instance where she had chosen silence over action. Her roommate, a senator's daughter named Brittany, who treated her with polite indifference, had already left for breakfast by the time Kira dragged herself from bed with eyes that felt like they had been rubbed with sandpaper. She slipped into the assembly hall just as Headmaster Brennan was beginning his remarks about the upcoming winter formal, the same speech about tradition and community that he delivered every year with minor variations. The irony of his words about respect and mutual support wasn't lost on her as she searched for an empty seat in the back rows, hoping to become invisible once again. She had barely settled into her chair when she felt someone grab the back of her blazer with enough force to jerk her backward. Before she could react or even process what was happening, there was a loud ripping sound that seemed to echo through the entire hall like the crack of thunder. The fabric tore cleanly down the back seam, the cheap material giving way like tissue paper, leaving her sitting there in her thin white blouse while her ruined blazer hung in tatters around her shoulders. The silence that followed was deafening, more oppressive than any sound could have been. Every head in the assembly hall turned to stare at her with the synchronized precision of a Greek chorus. And Kira felt her face burn with humiliation so intense it felt like standing too close to a furnace. The exposure was complete and devastating, not just the physical exposure of her modest blouse and the worn bra strap that was now visible through the thin fabric, but the emotional exposure of being marked once again as different, as other, as less than human, less. Preston Blackwood stood behind her like a Greek god of cruelty, holding the torn piece of fabric with an expression of mock concern that somehow made his handsome face look like a mask worn by something inhuman. His blue eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction as he surveyed the damage he had wrought, and his voice carried just the right note of false sympathy when he spoke. "Oh no," he said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, but carefully modulated to sound helpful rather than mocking. "Looks like someone's second-hand uniform couldn't handle the stress of daily wear. Don't worry, Montrose. I'm sure the school has some spare uniforms in the lost and found. They might be a little used, but I'm sure you're accustomed to that by now." The laughter that followed was like a physical assault, washing over her in waves of cruel amusement that seemed to come from every direction at once. It wasn't just Preston's crew laughing now. Other students were joining in, caught up in the mob mentality that turned ordinary teenagers into something resembling a pack of hyenas. Even some of the younger faculty members were struggling to hide their smiles, as if her humiliation were nothing more than a momentarily amusing distraction from the tedium of morning assembly. Kira sat frozen in her chair, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white as bone. The torn blazer hung around her like the remains of her dignity, and she could feel the eyes of 300 students boring into her with the intensity of laser beams. The sensation was suffocating, overwhelming, like being buried alive under the weight of their collective judgment. "Mr. Blackwood," Headmaster Brennan's voice cut through the laughter with the authority of someone who had spent decades managing the entitled children of the wealthy elite. But there was no real censure in his tone, no genuine anger at what had just occurred. He sounded more like someone mildly annoyed by a disruption to his scheduled programming than outraged by an act of deliberate cruelty. "Please take your seat." "Of course, sir," Preston replied, with the exaggerated politeness that he had perfected over years of getting away with exactly this kind of behavior. "I was just trying to help a fellow student who seemed to be experiencing some wardrobe difficulties." As he walked back to his seat with the satisfied swagger of someone who had just completed a successful mission, his eyes found Marcus across the aisle. The look that passed between them was laden with meaning. This was what happened to people who associated with her. This was the price of showing her kindness. This was the natural order of things being restored. Kira stood up slowly, her legs trembling with the effort of supporting her weight. Each movement felt like it was taking place underwater, slowed by the crushing pressure of hundreds of stairs. She walked toward the exit with as much dignity as she could muster, her torn blazer clutched against her chest like armor that had failed to protect her when she needed it most. Behind her, she could hear the whispers and muffled laughter following her like a pack of hungry wolves, growing bolder now that their prey was in full retreat. She made it to the bathroom before the tears came, hot and angry and filled with years of suppressed rage. The fluorescent lights were harsh and unforgiving, making her face look pale and haggard in the mirror above the sink. Her dark hair was disheveled from the morning struggle to get ready on time. Her eyes were rimmed with red from lack of sleep and overwhelming emotion, and her blazer hung around her like the tattered remains of her hopes for a normal life at Westfield Academy. As she stared at her reflection, really looked at herself for the first time in months, something fundamental shifted inside her chest. The face looking back at her was familiar yet strange, like meeting someone she had once known intimately but hadn't seen in years. There was something in her eyes that had been missing for so long she had forgotten it existed. A spark of defiance, a glimmer of the person she had been before Westfield Academy had tried to convince her that she was worthless. This was the face of the girl who had won the state Taekwondo championship 3 years running, setting records that still stood in her division. This was the girl who had broken 3 boards with a single kick during her black belt test, drawing gasps of amazement from the watching crowd. This was the girl who had never backed down from a challenge, who had faced opponents twice her size and emerged victorious through skill and determination, rather than luck or charity. Master Chen's teachings about restraint and control suddenly felt less like wisdom and more like chains holding her back from justice. She thought about Marcus, beaten and humiliated because he had dared to show her kindness, forced to withdraw his invitation to the dance because associating with her had made him a target. She thought about every cruel word, every deliberate humiliation, every moment of fear that had defined her existence at Westfield Academy for the past 6 months. "No more," she whispered to her reflection, and for the first time in months, she recognized the person staring back at her. The transformation wasn't dramatic or supernatural. She didn't suddenly grow 6 inches or develop superhuman strength. But something in her posture changed, something in her eyes hardened, and the girl who had been cowering in corners for half a year began to remember what it felt like to be strong. Kira Montrose spent the rest of that day in careful preparation, moving through her classes with a focus and intensity that several teachers commented on later. She went to her dormitory room during the lunch period, and changed into a fresh uniform, but this time she moved with purpose rather than the defeated shuffle that had characterized her movements for months. She tied her hair back in a tight ponytail that would stay out of her face during physical activity, and spent an hour stretching and practicing her forms in the cramped space between her bed and her roommate's desk. Her body remembered the movements with muscle memory that went deeper than conscious thought. The precise angle of a kick, the exact timing of a block, the way power flowed from her center of gravity through her limbs like electricity through a conductor. Each form was a meditation in motion, a reminder of who she had been and who she could be again if she chose to reclaim that identity. The next morning, she walked into the dining hall with her head held high for the first time since arriving at Westfield Academy. The great hall stretched before her like a battlefield, its vaulted ceiling supported by Gothic arches that had witnessed decades of social warfare among the children of America's elite. Long tables filled with expensive place settings created neat rows where students sat according to an unspoken but rigidly enforced hierarchy, with the most privileged claiming the spots closest to the tall windows that overlooked the school's manicured grounds. Preston and his crew occupied their usual table near the center of the room, positioned perfectly to observe and comment on the social dynamics playing out around them. They were regaling their audience with what was undoubtedly a greatly embellished version of yesterday's humiliation, their voices carrying the confident tones of natural storytellers who knew their material would be well received. Wade was holding up torn pieces of fabric that he had apparently kept as trophies, demonstrating with theatrical gestures how easily the charity case's blazer had given way under pressure. His thick fingers worked the damaged material like a magician's props, twisting and manipulating it for maximum effect, while his audience laughed and applauded his performance. "And then," Wade was saying, his voice pitched to carry to nearby tables, "she just sat there for like 10 seconds, staring at everyone like a deer caught in headlights. I thought she was going to start crying right there in front of God and everybody." "The best part," Jasper added with the clinical precision that made his cruelty so cutting, "was watching Rivera's face when it happened. You could practically see him calculating the social cost of being associated with damaged goods." Preston's laughter was warm and rich and completely without empathy, the sound of someone who had never questioned his right to treat other human beings as entertainment. "I almost felt sorry for her," he said with mock sympathy. "Almost. But then I remembered that she chose to come here, chose to try to play in a league that's clearly beyond her capabilities." Kira got her breakfast from the serving line, with hands that were steady for the first time in weeks. The familiar weight of the tray, loaded with food that she would normally have been too nervous to eat, felt solid and real in her grip. She walked directly toward their table with measured steps, her movement cutting through the dining hall's social geography like a knife through silk. The conversation died as she approached, replaced by the kind of expectant silence that preceded either comedy or tragedy, depending on your point of view. She could feel the attention of the entire dining hall focusing on her like sunlight through a magnifying glass, but instead of burning her as it had so many times before, the scrutiny felt almost empowering. "Preston," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden quiet with a strength that surprised even her. "I believe this belongs to you." She held up the torn blazer, and for a moment, confusion flickered across Preston's aristocratic features like clouds passing over the sun. His blue eyes narrowed as he tried to process what was happening, his mind working to understand why his usual victim was approaching him rather than fleeing, as she had done so many times before. Then his expression hardened into its familiar mask of cruel amusement, the look of someone who had been presented with an unexpected but welcome opportunity for entertainment. "I don't know what you're talking about, Montrose," he said, with the practiced innocence of someone who had years of experience denying obvious truths. That's your blazer, not mine. I was just trying to help when it fell apart due to poor construction." "You ripped it," Kira said simply, her voice carrying the kind of matter-of-fact certainty that made argument seem pointless. "In front of everyone. Are you accusing me of something?" Preston stood up slowly, unfolding his impressive frame with the deliberate menace of a cobra rising to strike. He used his considerable height advantage exactly as he had been trained to do, looming over her in a display of physical intimidation that had worked countless times before. Because that sounds like a pretty serious accusation to make without proof. Around them, the dining hall had gone completely silent, the kind of profound quiet that usually preceded either violence or revelation. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work to watch the confrontation, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. "I'm not accusing you of anything," Kira said, her voice remaining steady and conversational despite the growing pressure of the moment. "I'm stating a fact. You ripped my blazer because you're a coward who gets off on humiliating people smaller than you." The words hit Preston like a slap across the face, and she could see his carefully constructed mask beginning to crack around the edges. His jaw tightened with barely controlled rage, and the muscles in his neck stood out like cables under tension. For someone who had spent his entire life being treated with deference and respect, being called a coward in front of his peers was the kind of insult that demanded immediate and overwhelming response. "You want to be careful how you talk to me, scholarship girl," he said, his voice dropping to the low, dangerous register that he had perfected over years of intimidating those he considered beneath him. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." "Actually," Kira said, taking a step closer instead of backing away as every instinct and months of conditioning screamed at her to do, "I think I do. You're capable of picking on people who can't fight back. You're capable of making others feel small so you can feel big. You're capable of destroying someone's property and then lying about it because you know your daddy's money will protect you from consequences." She paused, letting the words sink in, watching as his face flushed red with the kind of rage that came from having uncomfortable truths spoken aloud. "But when someone stands up to you?" She smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression, containing none of the warmth or shyness that had characterized her interactions with others for the past 6 months. "Well, we're about to find out, aren't we?" Preston's control snapped like a rubber band stretched beyond its breaking point. His hand shot out to grab her shoulder, probably intending to push her away or shake her into submission. Exactly the kind of casual violence that he had used to maintain his position in the social hierarchy for years. It was the response she had been hoping for, the justification she needed to do what every fiber of her being was screaming to do. The moment his fingers made contact with her blazer, Kira moved with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years training for exactly this kind of moment. Her right hand came up to trap his wrist in a grip that was surprisingly strong for someone of her size, while her left hand struck his elbow with surgical precision. The joint hyperextended with a wet popping sound that echoed through the dining hall like a gunshot, and Preston let out a roar of pain and surprise that was part anger, part shock, and part fear. But Kira wasn't finished. Couldn't be finished, not after months of accumulated humiliation and rage. As Preston instinctively tried to pull back from the source of his pain, she stepped forward and drove her knee up into his solar plexus with the kind of devastating accuracy that only came from years of practice. The strike landed exactly where she had aimed it, driving the air from his lungs in a whoosh that left him gasping and clutching his stomach. Wade and Jasper started to move, their loyalty to Preston overriding their sense of self-preservation, but Kira was already spinning to face them with the controlled fury of a hurricane given human form. Her leg swept out in a perfect arc, the movement as beautiful as it was destructive, catching Wade behind the knees and sending his stocky frame crashing backward into a table laden with expensive china and crystal. Dishes scattered and shattered as he went down hard, his head striking the table's edge with a dull thud that made several students gasp in shock. The sound of breaking porcelain filled the air like applause, and Wade's groan of pain provided an uncomfortable bass note to the symphony of destruction. Jasper hesitated for just a moment, long enough for his analytical mind to process what was happening and realize that he might be facing something far more dangerous than a helpless victim. But that moment of hesitation was all Kira needed to close the distance between them, her movement flowing like water around stone. Her palm strike caught him in the center of his chest with the kind of focused power that Master Chen had spent years teaching her to generate. The impact sent him stumbling backward, his arms windmilling as he tried to maintain his balance. But Kira was already there, her leg sweeping his feet out from under him with the inevitability of gravity itself. He hit the floor with a crash that shook the entire dining hall, his perfectly styled hair now disheveled and his face wearing an expression of complete bewilderment. The whole exchange had taken less than 10 seconds, but those 10 seconds had changed everything. Preston was still gasping for breath, his face pale and his eyes wide with the shock of someone who had never before encountered consequences for his actions. Wade was groaning on the floor beside the overturned table, surrounded by the remains of what had probably been several $100s worth of place settings. Jasper was staring up at the vaulted ceiling with the glazed expression of someone whose worldview had just been fundamentally altered. Kira stood in the center of the chaos, her breathing barely elevated despite the explosive burst of activity, her posture relaxed but ready for whatever might come next. The dining hall was so quiet that the sound of her footsteps seemed to echo like thunder as she walked over to where Preston knelt on the polished floor, still struggling to draw breath into his traumatized lungs. She crouched down beside him, bringing her face level with his, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but carried clearly through the profound silence that had fallen over the room. "The next time you want to humiliate someone," she said with the kind of calm certainty that was somehow more threatening than any shouted threat could have been, "make sure you know who you're dealing with first." Preston looked up at her with eyes that were no longer cold and calculating, but wide with shock and something that might have been fear. For the first time since she had known him, he looked exactly what he was beneath all the privilege and posturing, a frightened boy who had discovered that the world was bigger and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. "You're insane," he wheezed, the words coming out between gasps as he struggled to restore his breathing to normal. "No," Kira said, standing up and smoothing down her blazer with hands that showed no trace of tremor. "I'm just done being your victim." She looked around the dining hall, taking in the sea of stunned faces that stared back at her with expressions ranging from shock to fear to something that might have been admiration. Marcus was sitting frozen at his table, staring at her with an expression of awe and something that definitely looked like pride. Other students were looking at her with a mixture of fear and respect that she had never seen before, the kind of wary acknowledgement that predators gave to something that had proven itself capable of fighting back. "Anyone else have something they'd like to say about my blazer?" she asked conversationally, her voice carrying easily through the silence. The quiet stretched on, broken only by Wade's continued groaning and the sound of Preston's labored breathing. Finally, tentatively, one of the younger students began to clap. The sound was hesitant at first, uncertain, but then another student joined in and another, until the entire dining hall was filled with applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. It wasn't universal. Some students sat in stunned silence. Others looked frightened or disapproving. But there was enough support to make it clear that not everyone had approved of Preston's reign of terror. The younger students in particular seemed to be applauding with genuine enthusiasm, as if they were celebrating the fall of a tyrant who had made their own lives more difficult. Kira walked over to where Marcus sat, still staring at her with wonder, and something that looked very much like renewed attraction. His dark eyes were bright with excitement, and when she approached his table, he stood up with the kind of eager energy that suggested he wanted to say something important. "So," she said, her voice carrying just a hint of the old shyness that had characterized her interactions with him before this morning's revelation, "is that offer for the winter formal still open?" His smile was brilliant, lighting up his entire face with the kind of joy that made her heart skip beats in her chest. "I thought you'd never ask," he said, and the happiness in his voice made it clear that Preston's threats and intimidation had lost their power to control him. The aftermath of the dining hall incident rippled through Westfield Academy like a stone thrown into still water, creating waves that spread far beyond the immediate participants and touched every corner of the school's carefully maintained social order. Preston, Wade, and Jasper were taken to the infirmary in a small procession that resembled a defeated army retreating from a battlefield, their injuries requiring immediate medical attention and their pride requiring considerably more time to heal. The official story, as reported to parents and recorded in school records, was that there had been an altercation during the breakfast period that had resulted in several students requiring medical treatment. But everyone who had witnessed the event knew what had really happened. The untouchable had been touched, the predator had become prey, and the natural order of Westfield Academy had been fundamentally altered in the space of 10 devastating seconds. News of the confrontation spread through the school with the speed and efficiency of wildfire, growing and changing with each retelling until the basic facts became legend. By lunchtime, stories were circulating about Kira's mysterious fighting skills, with speculation ranging from the reasonable, she had taken self-defense classes, to the absurd, she was secretly a government agent. The dining hall staff spent the morning sweeping up broken china and rearranging furniture, their work providing a physical reminder of what had transpired and ensuring that no one could simply pretend it hadn't happened. Kira found herself called to Headmaster Brennan's office that afternoon, summoned by a formal written request that was delivered during her advanced literature class by a secretary whose expression suggested she was delivering news of a death in the family. The walk through the corridors to the administrative wing felt like a final march, with other students stopping their conversations to stare at her with expressions that ranged from admiration to fear to barely concealed excitement. The headmaster's office was a monument to academic tradition and administrative authority, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes and portraits of distinguished predecessors who had guided Westfield Academy through various crises over the decades. The massive oak desk that dominated the room had been hand-carved by craftsmen whose great-great-grandsons were probably still making furniture for the wealthy elite, and the Persian rug that covered the polished floor cost more than most people's annual salary. Headmaster Brennan sat behind his desk like a judge preparing to deliver sentence, his silver hair perfectly styled and his wire-rimmed spectacles reflecting the afternoon light that streamed through tall windows. He was reviewing what she assumed was her disciplinary file, though given the morning's events it was probably more accurately described as her criminal record. "Miss Montrose," he said finally, looking up at her over his reading glasses with the expression of someone who was dealing with a problem he had never expected to encounter. "I'm told there was some kind of incident in the dining hall this morning." "Yes, sir," Kira replied, settling into the chair across from his desk with the kind of composure that she had learned from years of competitive martial arts. Facing judges and referees had taught her that projecting calm confidence was often as important as actual performance. "And you were involved in this incident?" "Yes, sir." Headmaster Brennan set down the file and leaned back in his leather chair, studying her with the kind of analytical gaze that had probably been perfected over decades of dealing with the children of powerful families. "The witness reports are somewhat contradictory," he said carefully. "Some students claim that Mr. Blackwood and his associates attacked you without provocation. Others suggest that you initiated the confrontation through verbal aggression." Kira met his gaze steadily, drawing on the mental discipline that Master Chen had taught her, along with the physical techniques. "I defended myself when Preston grabbed me, sir. Everything else was simply a natural consequence of that decision." "Natural consequence," the headmaster repeated slowly, tasting the words as if they were unfamiliar in his mouth. "Miss Montrose, are you aware that Mr. Blackwood has a separated elbow and 2 cracked ribs? Mr. Thornton has a concussion and will require several stitches. Mr. Knox is suffering from what the medical staff describes as severe bruising to his chest and back." "I'm aware that they were injured during our confrontation." "Yes, sir." "And you don't feel that perhaps your response was excessive given the circumstances?" For a moment, Kira considered her words carefully, knowing that her future at Westfield Academy might depend on how she handled this conversation. "Sir," she said finally, "Preston Blackwood has been systematically tormenting me for months. He destroyed my property in front of the entire school community. When I confronted him about his behavior, he became physically aggressive and put his hands on me. I simply responded with appropriate force to defend myself." Headmaster Brennan was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled in front of him as he processed her words. The silence stretched between them like a bridge that might either support or collapse under the weight of truth. "There will be consequences for this, Miss Montrose," he said finally. "Regardless of the provocation or circumstances, violence is never the appropriate solution to our problems. Westfield Academy has a zero-tolerance policy regarding physical altercations between students." "Respectfully, sir," Kira replied, "neither is ignoring systematic bullying and harassment. I tried to handle this situation through proper channels. I spoke to teachers, I avoided confrontation, I attempted to resolve things peacefully. None of those approaches worked." The headmaster's eyebrows rose slightly, suggesting that her response had surprised him. "Are you suggesting that the faculty and administration have been negligent in addressing these issues?" "I'm suggesting that sometimes people need to stand up for themselves when the systems designed to protect them have failed to do so." Another long silence filled the office, during which Kira could hear the distant sounds of normal school life continuing outside. Students moving between classes, teachers conducting lessons, the ordinary business of education proceeding as if the world hadn't fundamentally shifted that morning. Finally, Headmaster Brennan sighed with the weight of someone who was being forced to make decisions he would rather avoid. "You'll have detention for the remainder of the week," he said, "and I expect you to write a formal letter of apology to Mr. Blackwood, Mr. Thornton, and Mr. Knox for your actions." "I'll serve the detention," Kira said quietly but firmly, "but I won't apologize for defending myself against people who have been making my life miserable for months." "Miss Montrose, would you apologize to someone who had been systematically tormenting you for months, someone who humiliated you in front of your peers and then initiated physical contact when you finally found the courage to confront them about their behavior?" The headmaster studied her for a long moment, and Kira thought she saw something like grudging respect flicker in his eyes. He was probably not accustomed to students who were willing to challenge his authority so directly, particularly students whose continued enrollment at the academy depended on their scholarship status. "Very well," he said finally. "Detention only. But Miss Montrose—" He leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more serious. "I trust this was an isolated incident. We cannot have students settling their differences through violence, regardless of the circumstances that led to such confrontations." "It was a learning experience, sir," Kira replied carefully, "for everyone involved." As she left the office, Kira felt a strange sense of lightness, as if a weight she had been carrying for months had finally been lifted from her shoulders. The hallways that had once felt like gauntlets of judgment and hostility now seemed like ordinary corridors filled with ordinary students going about their ordinary business. Some of them stared at her as she passed, but the quality of their attention had changed. There was wariness there, and respect, and even a little fear, but there was no longer the casual dismissal that had characterized their attitudes toward her for so long. The change in how others treated her was immediate and dramatic, visible in dozens of small interactions throughout the remainder of the day. Students who had previously looked through her as if she were invisible now nodded respectfully when she passed in the corridors. A few even stopped to speak to her, offering words of support or congratulations that suggested her actions in the dining hall had resonated with more people than she had expected. The younger students in particular seemed to regard her with something approaching hero worship. She overheard whispered conversations about the scholarship girl who took down Preston Blackwood, and caught glimpses of admiring looks from students who had probably been suffering under their own versions of systematic intimidation. It was clear that Preston's behavior had created more victims than just herself, and her successful resistance had given hope to others who had felt powerless. But perhaps the most significant change was in Preston himself and his inner circle. When they returned to classes 3 days later, the transformation was striking and immediate. Preston's arm was in a professional sling, and his usual confident swagger had been replaced by a cautious wariness that suggested he was seeing the world through new eyes. Wade sported a spectacular collection of bruises and moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose head was still ringing from its encounter with the dining room table. Jasper's posture was different too, less predatory, more defensive, as if he had learned that the world contained dangers he had never previously considered. More importantly, they went out of their way to avoid her. When she entered a classroom, they would find reasons to sit on the opposite side of the room. When she walked down a corridor, they would suddenly discover compelling reasons to examine their phones or engage in intense conversations with nearby friends. The predatory confidence that had characterized their interactions with her for months had been replaced by the kind of careful avoidance that suggested they had learned to respect her personal space in ways they had never bothered to before. The winter formal arrived 2 weeks later, and Kira found herself standing in front of her dormitory room's small mirror, adjusting the deep blue dress she had purchased for the occasion with money saved from her modest spending allowance. The dress was simple but elegant, purchased from a department store rather than a boutique, but it made her feel like someone entirely different from the frightened girl who had arrived at Westfield Academy months earlier. The transformation was more than just the dress. It was in her posture, her expression, the way she carried herself through space. The girl in the mirror stood straight and tall, her dark eyes bright with confidence rather than fear, her smile genuine rather than apologetic. She had learned to take up space in the world rather than trying to minimize her presence, and the change was visible in every line of her body. Marcus arrived to pick her up, looking handsome in his black tuxedo, his face lighting up when he saw her waiting for him in the dormitory's formal sitting room. The other students gathered there, dates waiting for their partners, friends making last-minute adjustments to hair and makeup, watched their interaction with interest, but without the malicious anticipation that such attention would have carried just weeks earlier. "You look incredible," he said, offering her his arm with the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that had probably been drummed into him by generations of well-bred ancestors. "Absolutely stunning." "You clean up pretty well yourself," she replied, accepting the small corsage he had brought for her. White roses with baby's breath, simple and elegant and perfect for her dress. The familiar flutter of attraction was still there when he looked at her, but it was accompanied now by something deeper: respect, admiration, and the kind of genuine affection that came from seeing someone at their most vulnerable and their most strong. The formal was held in the school's grand ballroom, a space that had been decorated with thousands of twinkling lights and elegant flower arrangements that probably cost more than most families spent on their entire holiday celebrations. The rooms sparkled like something from a fairy tale, with ice sculptures and flowing fabric transforming the already impressive space into something truly magical. As they entered together, Kira felt the familiar flutter of nervousness, but it was different now. The anticipation of someone who belonged, rather than the fear of someone who was perpetually out of place. She was no longer the frightened scholarship student trying to become invisible. She was Kira Montrose, and she had earned her place at this dance through determination and strength rather than charity or luck. They danced to slow songs and fast ones, their movements synchronized in ways that suggested they had been partners for years rather than weeks. Marcus was an excellent dancer, his leading confident without being domineering, and Kira found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the music and the warmth of his arms around her waist. They laughed at his attempts to navigate the elaborate buffet table while maintaining the dignity required by formal wear, and talked about everything and nothing with the kind of easy intimacy that suggested a relationship built on genuine understanding rather than social convenience. For the first time since arriving at Westfield Academy, Kira felt truly happy, not just the absence of fear or pain, but actual joy bubbling up from somewhere deep in her chest. She was surrounded by beauty and music and the company of someone who genuinely cared about her. And the contrast with her previous months of isolation was so stark that it felt almost surreal. The evening took an unexpected turn when Preston Blackwood approached their table during a break between songs, his movement hesitant in a way that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. He was still wearing the sling that protected his injured arm, and his usual confident demeanor had been replaced by something that might have been humility, or at least a reasonable approximation of that unfamiliar emotion. Marcus tensed beside her, his body shifting subtly into a protective posture that suggested he was prepared for trouble. But Kira placed a calming hand on his arm, recognizing something in Preston's expression that suggested this encounter might be different from their previous confrontations. "Montrose," Preston said, his voice lacking the edge of superiority that had characterized every previous interaction between them. "Could I talk to you for a minute, please?" The addition of that final word was significant. Preston Blackwood did not ask for things, he demanded them. The fact that he was making a request rather than issuing a command suggested that their relationship had fundamentally shifted in ways that went beyond simple fear. "It's okay," Kira told Marcus, then looked up at Preston with the kind of steady gaze that she had learned to use in competition, assessing but not aggressive, ready but not threatening. "What do you want?" Preston seemed to struggle with the words, his aristocratic features showing an unfamiliar vulnerability that made him look younger and more human than she had ever seen him. "I wanted to—" He paused, clearly finding the words difficult to form. "I wanted to say that I'm sorry for everything. The blazer, the comments, the systematic harassment, all of it. I was wrong." Kira studied his face carefully, looking for any sign of deception or mockery that might suggest this was another elaborate setup designed to humiliate her in front of their peers. But his expression seemed genuine, even if the apology obviously came hard to someone who had probably never had to admit fault before in his privileged life. "Why now?" she asked, genuinely curious about what had prompted this unexpected reversal. Preston glanced around the ballroom, taking in the couples dancing and laughing together, the fairy tale decorations, the atmosphere of celebration and joy. When he looked back at her, his blue eyes held something that might have been regret. "Because I've had a lot of time to think while I've been recovering," he said quietly. "Time to think about what kind of person I want to be, what kind of legacy I want to leave behind me. And I realized that who I was before, that wasn't someone I could be proud of. That wasn't someone worthy of the privileges I've been given." "And you think an apology fixes everything, erases months of deliberate cruelty?" "No," he said quickly, shaking his head with the earnestness of someone who had clearly thought about this conversation extensively. "I think it's just the beginning, but I had to start somewhere, and I figured starting with the truth was probably the right choice." Kira was quiet for a moment, considering not just his words, but the implications of accepting or rejecting his apology. She thought about Master Chen's teachings about forgiveness and redemption, about the difference between justice and revenge, about the kind of person she wanted to be now that she had reclaimed her power. Then she stood up, and Preston instinctively took a step back with the wariness of someone who had learned that she was capable of violence when provoked. But instead of the physical confrontation he was obviously expecting, she simply extended her hand in the universal gesture of reconciliation. "Thank you for the apology," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the music and conversation surrounding them. "I appreciate the courage it must have taken to admit you were wrong. And Preston?" She paused until he met her eyes directly. "I hope you figure out who you want to be. Everyone deserves a chance to be better than they were." He stared at her outstretched hand for a moment, as if he couldn't quite believe that she was offering him a path toward redemption rather than revenge. Then he reached out and shook it, his grip firm but not aggressive, respectful rather than domineering. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough with emotion that he was clearly struggling to control. "Me too." As he walked away, Marcus shook his head in amazement at what he had just witnessed. "I can't believe that just happened," he said. 6 months ago, if someone had told me that Preston Blackwood would apologize to anyone for anything, I would have laughed in their face." "People can change," Kira said, settling back into her chair with the satisfaction of someone who had chosen mercy over vengeance and found it more fulfilling than she had expected. "Sometimes they just need the right motivation to examine their behavior and make different choices." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of music and laughter, and the kind of happiness that Kira had almost forgotten was possible. As the formal wound down and couples began to drift toward the exits, she and Marcus found themselves on the ballroom's balcony, looking out over the academy's moonlit grounds with the contentment of people who had found exactly where they belonged. "I have to ask," Marcus said, his arm around her waist providing warmth against the cool evening air. "Where did you learn to fight like that? What you did in the dining hall was incredible, like something out of an action movie." Kira smiled, leaning into his warmth and feeling more relaxed and happy than she could remember being in years. "I've been studying Taekwondo since I was 8 years old," she said. "My instructor always taught me that fighting should be a last resort, that true strength comes from avoiding conflict whenever possible and using violence only when all other options have been exhausted. So why didn't you use those skills sooner? Why did you let them torment you for so long?" The question was fair, and Kira had been asking herself the same thing for the past few weeks. "Because I believed him," she said simply. "I thought that if I just endured it long enough, if I remained peaceful and non-violent, the situation would eventually resolve itself. I was wrong. Sometimes you have to fight for the right to be left alone. And sometimes violence is the only language that bullies understand." Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing her words and the implications of what she was telling him. "Do you regret it?" he asked finally. "What you did in the dining hall, the way you handled things?" Kira considered the question seriously, thinking about the events of the past few weeks and their consequences. "I regret that it came to that," she said honestly. "I regret that it was necessary, that the systems designed to protect students failed so completely that I had to take matters into my own hands. But I don't regret standing up for myself. For the first time in months, I feel like I belong here, like I have the right to take up space in this world." "You always belonged here," Marcus said softly, his voice warm with affection and conviction. "You just needed to realize it yourself. You needed to remember who you were underneath all their attempts to make you feel small." As they stood there in the moonlight, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the academy grounds, Kira reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had learned that strength wasn't just about physical capability or martial arts skills. It was about knowing when to use those capabilities and when to show restraint. She had discovered that sometimes the greatest victory was not in defeating an enemy completely, but in giving them the opportunity to become someone better than they had been. Most importantly, she had learned that she was not powerless and never had been. She had simply chosen to be powerless, had allowed others to convince her that she was weak when she was actually stronger than most of them could ever hope to be. That choice had cost her months of unnecessary suffering, but it had also taught her valuable lessons about resilience, about the difference between being a victim and being victimized, about the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult or dangerous. The old Kira would have been afraid to hope, afraid to believe that things could really change, afraid that happiness was just a temporary illusion that would be stripped away as soon as she allowed herself to believe in it. But the new Kira, the one who had faced her fears and emerged stronger, the one who had reclaimed her power and used it wisely, knew that the future was hers to write. As she and Marcus walked back toward the dormitories hand in hand, Kira felt a profound sense of peace settling over her like a warm blanket. She had found her place at Westfield Academy, not by hiding from who she was or trying to become someone else, but by embracing her identity fully and refusing to let anyone else define her worth. The girl, who had once cowered in corners, now walked tall through moonlit corridors, secure in the knowledge that she would never again allow anyone to make her feel small or powerless or unworthy of respect. The transformation was complete, but the story was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, new relationships to build, and new boundaries to establish. But whatever came next, Kira Montrose would face it as herself, strong, confident, and unafraid to take up the space in the world that had always been rightfully hers. The moonlight caught the small smile on her face as they walked, an expression of quiet satisfaction and hard-won wisdom that suggested she had finally learned the most important lesson of all: that she was enough, exactly as she was, and that anyone who couldn't see that wasn't worth her time or energy. The scared girl who had arrived at Westfield Academy 6 months ago was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that true strength came not from avoiding conflict, but from choosing your battles wisely and fighting them with honor when fighting became necessary. And in the distance, the lights of the academy continued to shine like beacons in the darkness, illuminating a path toward a future that finally felt full of promise rather than fear.